I call the Honourable Member Andrew Williams.
Mr Speaker, honourable members, firstly can I congratulate you, Mr Speaker, on your reappointment to the role as an officer of the Parliament. I have greatly enjoyed dealing with you in other capacities over the years, and I've always enjoyed the relationship we've had in local government and working with you in your central government role, and I appreciate the support and wisdom and great knowledge in many areas that you have been able to give to me over the years. So I do congratulate you and your fellow officers of the Parliament. We're here today to further the Taxation, International Investment and Remedial Matters Bill 2012, which New Zealand First will support this bill, but we do have some reservations and caveats in relation to it. The bill is intended, of course, to move to allow reciprocal arrangements between countries for investments and taxation to ensure that companies and businesses are fairly treated in the various jurisdictions where they are operating. However, we would not wish to see departures from New Zealand as a result, or any encouragement for companies to see this as an opportunity to set up their businesses elsewhere for the benefit of a lower tax regime in some other jurisdiction. Increasingly, of course, business these days is done over the internet, in the ether, via all sorts of other means rather than physical hard products and physical hard manufactured goods. And therefore, as a result, companies can in effect be based anywhere. They are almost cyber companies in many respects, because you are only as good as the distance from your mobile phone or your laptop. And so as a result, companies can operate from anywhere. Therefore, we certainly would not want to see a situation occurring where this was used as a matter of convenience so that companies could operate in cyberspace in order to secure more advantageous tax regimes. We do not have to remind you of New Zealand First's long-standing commitment to this sort of situation, going back to the most famous wine box saga in the 90s. And many of you will recall, particularly those of you who were in this House at the time, Mr Speaker, that, Mr Speaker, you will recall, and fellow members will recall, that that was a sad period of time in New Zealand, because it was very clearly a situation where there was an attempt, perhaps on the part of some, to evade paying their due taxes to the government and the Crown of New Zealand. In that situation, it was convenient, Mr Speaker, for some companies to find alternate locations for their registration of their companies, and in so doing it was a significant situation in terms of the revenues to this country. For instance, Treasury officials estimated during that period of time that New Zealand was losing up to $1 billion a year in the mid to late 1980s through the wine box tax deals situation. That companies' tax money was not being paid, meaning that the burden to meet the government's expenses here in New Zealand on welfare, health and education fell onto the ordinary PAYE taxpayers. It meant that the government kept running budget deficits for a lot longer than it might have needed to, and those deficits had to be funded by borrowing. Mr Speaker, we certainly wouldn't want that situation to be repeated again in this decade. It also raises this tax, international investment and remedial matters, the aspect of third-party situations, where, again, Mr Speaker, I would remind you, and looking back in the records from those wine box days, that apart from Australia, the other country that took a pounding from the wine box deals was Japan. Tax credits funneling something like $1.2 billion to generate tax certificates were subsequently presented for tax rebates in Japan. The tax losses to Japan from those deals alone maybe in the region of almost $200 million. So, Mr. Chairman, as I said at the beginning of my address, Mr. Speaker, we certainly would not want a situation where clever, creative accountants, clever, creative organisations try to use the Taxation, International Investment and Remedial Matters Bill and the law that will come out of that as a means of avoiding or evading tax. And I'm talking not just about New Zealand companies, Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about international companies. We have a situation just in recent weeks which is before the courts in relation to some activities occurring in this country, Mr. Speaker, which perhaps are less than desirable and which we would not wish to be occurring in this country if they are proven through the courts to be so. So we certainly, Mr. Speaker, do not want at the same time to have international operators operating in this country for the purpose of avoiding perhaps taxes in their own areas of jurisdiction. New Zealand First has always supported reform of taxation, and our long-term objective is always that New Zealanders will pay less tax in the long run. Mr. Speaker, we would like to see tax laws simplified and enforced so that they apply equally to all taxpayers. The burden of tax should fall equally to us all. It should not be imposed on some sections to the benefit of others. This includes incentives for increased research and development, and reduced tax on export industries is a main platform that New Zealand First, through this Parliament, would like to see moved on. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, and while this is slightly away from this particular bill, it does raise the issue and anomalies of instances of tax situations and pension situations for immigrants to this country and vice versa, New Zealand citizens living in other countries who don't necessarily secure the appropriate pensions and superannuitant payments because of the location of where they choose to live in their retirement. In a sense, it's a penalty to them, and therefore, while we are looking into this situation of being fair to corporates and companies, Mr. Speaker, to put them on a level playing field in terms of taxation so they can compete on world markets and compete in terms of investments around the world, it does also raise the irony that we do have individuals and people, citizens of this country and citizens who have come to this country who similarly perhaps are not on a level footing simply because of relocating to another country. So in a wider sense, I think in the future we need to raise our expectations in terms of fairness. It should not just be fairness to the corporate world and the business world, but perhaps in the future we need to give consideration to the everyday Joe Bloggs in the street who moves to another country, another location. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in closing, can I just say that taxation is with us all. It's something you do not avoid in life. It's one thing. That and death are two things you're assured of through life. And in terms of taxation, it is beholding to us all to ensure that taxes are fair. We do have an increasing burden in terms of health and education and social security. We do have a responsibility to provide for the people of this country and of this nation in a fair and equitable manner. And we do have to ensure that our companies and our corporates are competitive at the same time to compete on the world markets. I hope that this bill will be supported in the House, but with those caveats that when it does go through and is confirmed by this Parliament, that it is on the basis that it will ensure fair taxes both within New Zealand and in other markets where our corporates operate, to the benefit of the New Zealand economy, to the benefit of our corporates, and to ensure that New Zealand is a strong global player. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.